I've been spending a lot of time recently coding in VS Code. It's a free open source cross-platform text editor for pretty much any and all operating systems that you can think of. If you've watched this channel, you know I'm a very long time Vim user. And it might be a surprise to many people, I think, why, if you've used a text editor for so long, why would you actually switch to anything different? You know, moving between different computers pretty regularly. So having a work laptop, a personal laptop, and then having this machine, which is recording this right now, it's really hard to get Vim coordinated in all of these places. It's even harder when you consider that Vim runs in a terminal, and every terminal in all of those different machines is different. So I would regularly find myself, having something work just fine on my work laptop. I bring it over to my personal laptop, and suddenly, I don't have some dependency installed or something like that. It gets even worse, looking at my Windows computer, which is different than every other machine. I literally have never gotten Vim to work well on it at all. So although I've heard people talk a lot about VS Code, I basically found, an excuse to always stay inside of Vim. But for whatever reason, recently, it just got too exhausting, I guess. And so I ended up switching in I guess the last 6 or 7 weeks or so. And the results have actually been really good. Generally I think that my workflow is more or less the same. I find myself missing in some of the Vim emulation modes. A couple things that I'm still getting used to, but I think will be okay. But generally I'm really impressed with the speed and also with the plugin architecture. So to celebrate kind of the resurrection, I guess, of this channel, which is now called Bytesized Code, I wanted to start off a new series where we looked at some of these VS Code plugins. The series will probably never have a consistent theme. It's just kind of things that I think are interesting and useful. Well, probably more on the useful side because you are in sort of productivity, developer tool software. But generally, it's going to be focused on things that I think make your development process better. All of them are super useful, and I'll make sure to link them down below in the description so you can go install them yourself. Let's jump in and we'll look at my top three, I don't know about top three, but 3 of my favorite VS Code plugins that I found so far. I'm going to have a pretty straightforward VS Code install from the get-go. You can see I just have, the text is kind of blown up here, but I have a JavaScript file open. I also have a second JavaScript file called coolfunks, which we might hop into a little bit later. The first plugin I want to show you is the ESLint plugin. So the ESLint plugin, if you aren't familiar with ESLint, it is a JavaScript linter, meaning that it will go through your code and look for any errors, any kind of formatting mistakes. So it can really run the gamut from, things like, hey, you put too many spaces in one line here, or your, brackets are not correctly indented, all the way down to saying really useful things like, for instance, you spelled this function wrong, or you're calling something that doesn't exist, things that will actually cause your application to break. In particular, I think the VS Code plugin is really interesting. Basically makes use of VS Code's built-in highlighting to do things like, for instance, if we highlight this, we get this, I think they call it the quick fix window or something like that. Basically what this is it's going to be any kind of errors or anything like that from ESLint. And by default, you can plug in your own ESLint configuration. So there'll be a guide in the extension page, that's this one right here, on how to get started with that. I think what I used was standard, which is pretty straightforward, like JavaScript style guide. But you can see right away, I get all kinds of really interesting warnings and errors. So for instance, I get this no unused vars warning. It says list of names is assigned a value but never used. Down below, I called this this list of users function. So it says list of users is not defined. So you might think okay, why is that useful or whatever? Well, it turns out in this case, maybe what I wanted to do instead of list of users was actually call list of names. So I got a alert here that you are using a function that doesn't even exist. This is an example of how linting can kind of save you from fundamental code issues and errors. But it does other things that aren't as kind of important, but still useful, but not, getting your application to work. So things like strings must use single quote, you can customize this as well, obviously. Like for instance, a consistent set of like single quotes or double quotes can be useful to make it really easy to read through code. And what's also really useful about this ESLint plugin in particular is that you can basically fix, I think, what they call auto-fixable problems. So I'll just use this command here, ESLint fix all auto-fixable problems. And what it will do is it will go through and correct anything that it can, any of those kind of like warning level things where it knows what the fix is, it will go and do that for you automatically. There's instructions in the extension page as well for 2 different versions of that might be more useful. The first being basically making it so you can use a keyboard command. You can define whatever keyboard command you want. You'll type that and it'll automatically fix everything, which is great. I think the more useful one though is, and I highly recommend doing this even though it sounds a little intense, I guess a good way to put that, is just formatting everything every time that you save the file. So basically what will happen is, anytime I write something that has a indentation error, we'll do 3 extra spaces, so it's even more off. Anytime they have this error, I don't have it set up right now, but I would press, save, and it would automatically fix itself going right back to where it was. So that's the ESLint plugin. It's clearly very popular. It has 21.7 million installs, which is crazy. That's an insane amount of code being passed around. It would be very wild to be one of the authors of these plugins, I think. But go check that out. It's super useful, like I said, because obviously fixing issues with your code that cause it to not run. That's like, that's a given. You want code that works. But I think it's really interesting as you start to work on a project for a long period of time. Consistency around how you write your code can make it a lot easier to get, it makes it easier for you to come back yourself and understand what you were even doing 6 months ago. I have this problem all the time where I write something and, because I use like ESLint or I used to use a different tool in Vim, which I think was called Ale. Anytime, you have things like that kind of abstracting away the simpler decisions, like how things should be indented and what kind of quotes to use and things like that, it allows you to be more consistent with how you actually write the functionality of your code, which I think is really useful. The next plugin is this JavaScript code snippets plugin. Snippets are really interesting because I think that they can be really useful if you memorize them, but they're really hard to memorize. I've seen people do things like use flashcards or things like that to like really give the snippets like some kind of priority in their mind. I'm not sure I would go that far, but it is really interesting, and so I want to kind of explore like what this looks like. So each of these snippets can be invoked inside of JavaScript, TypeScript, or React, HTML, Vue. So all kinds of different places where you would be writing JavaScript normally. You can use these snippets to expand like short amounts of text into these longer, snippets of code. Like I said, I'm still very new to this, but it is really interesting to me. So let's try one. I'm going to make a class here. I'll just call it like test class. And I'm going to use my first snippet, which is the con snippet. You can see you actually type out con and you get this little, I'm pointing at the screen, but I guess you can probably see it. The add default constructor in a class. So this is a snippet. I'll press tab and you can see it will obviously expand the text out to, constructor. So this is a constructor function. But what's really cool is it puts my cursor automatically inside of the function arguments. So I can say, arg1, arg2, and if I press tab again, it actually jumps into, this is super cool. When I press tab, it jumps into the body of the function inside of constructor, right? So I could do like, console log. I would bet there's probably a snippet for that too, right? I should look. Console log enf, CLG. Okay, let's try that. So CLG arg1, And then tab will take me right back out of those function arguments. So if you've ever, like done the cursor into the parentheses, type something and then cursor back out, this is super cool. CLG arg2, press tab again. So there's all of these different snippets, and as you can imagine, I would be, I think, yeah, this is part of the snippets category. There is like so many of these snippets. You could also define your own custom ones. It'd be very interesting to try and figure out what sort of snippets I would want to define. But I can tell so far this is super useful. You could probably expand on this with things like, if you have like a particular code pattern that you write, maybe you take like an array in and you do like a filter and a sort and a map or something like that. You could define some sort of snippet where you could tab through each of them and like fill it out and stuff like that. To be a very interesting, an interesting way to think about code. I like this plugin a lot. I think it's super useful. I think obviously it's most useful if you take the time to actually memorize everything. I'm getting there. I'll get them. Maybe next time that I do a video, I'll just be like totally crushing it with snippets. It's a little bit more work, I think, than most of these other ones, though. The final plugin here is not JavaScript related, but I discovered it as I was looking through some plugins to try out, and I was really impressed with it. I think it is very interesting. It's called Better Comments. It has almost 900,000, again, it's a crazy number, 900,000 downloads on the marketplace. And basically what it does is it gives you like nice highlighting around comments. And what I thought was really interesting about it, it's not just, I guess, nice sort of styling or whatever. It's kind of a whole structure around how you write comments. I'm not sure that I completely agree with this idea. I think having like some sort of, or needing to have some sort of like legend, like in a map when you used to have like, I'm sure it's not, I bet it's still a thing. I just don't read any maps but Google Maps. But you have like a triangle, and a triangle represents this thing on the map or whatever. Having a legend here for comments is interesting and kind of confusing, but I think, yeah, it could be really interesting, especially on a team where everyone knows what the comments mean. So I have it installed here, and you can see I have this first line here where I've used the exclamation point. And this is kind of representative of, I would say, like an error level. So if you've ever done like log levels in programming, there's like, info, warning, level. I guess there's like fatal too. This is kind of like the error, right? It's red. Change this. This is very bad code. It's okay code, I think. But, just for a test. The next one here is the question mark. I think of this as kind of obviously like a question, but also sort of an info level, a thing where you can like kind of say, this is something we need to think about or something like that. And it kind of has, you can see they have different coloring. The star one is, I would say this is like a notice or like info. I would say this is like probably better suited for traditional comments. Make an HTTP request, return the names array inside of the response. What I think is really useful here is the very classic to-do comment, which gets its own coloring that I think really stands out. So to-do, actually call this function. Overall, I think this is a very interesting plugin. Like I said, it's really interesting and cool to see these different kind of colors and stuff like that. I can imagine you could build your own whole system of like in-code documentation and to give you a sense of like, this is where you last left this function, questions about how you can make it better, notices to people if other people come in your code base to say like, this function is particularly brittle or things like that. I'm not necessarily concerned about the idea of like introducing a legend of how to read your comments in your code. I just think it's interesting. I'm not sure if I can have a strong opinion on it. I might just have to play with it a little bit in a larger code base to understand what it actually looks like in practice. Okay, so this is the part where I always feel kind of weird, like, I'm gonna ask to like, have you liked the video and subscribe and things like that. What would be more interesting, that was my secret way of kind of saying that. What would be more interesting is if you're a VS Code user and you have plugins that you like or plugins that you don't like, I would love to hear about it in the comments. I would love to go check them out, maybe do a video on them as well. And if you have any thoughts about the plugins in this video, in particular, I think like the snippet one and the comment plugins are like I said, really interesting. It makes me wonder like whether it's worth all the work or not. What do you think? Let me know. I would love to hear about it. Again, as I mentioned earlier in the video, this is kind of the like the resurrection of this channel. If you watch my old Vim videos, that's awesome. I'm gonna start doing more, I guess, all kinds of videos here. I've been working with serverless stuff recently and JavaScript. I might even do some videos on like product-y kind of things, which I'm not great at, but I do think is very interesting. Make sure to subscribe, and there should be more videos coming soon. Thanks, hope you enjoyed it.